Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Wednesday talks for the Sharmin Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. I am Maral, and I am one of the postdocs in the center. Today, we have with us Professor Michelle Assay Eshghpour, who is going to present a talk entitled When Puppets Sing in Tehran, Reconfiguring Iran's National Opera. Michelle Assay is currently a Marie Curie UKRI Global Fellow at the Universities of Toronto and King's College and the Principal Investigator of WAMUS Iran, Women and Western Art Music in Iran. Born in Tehran, Professor Assay received her music and piano education through private lessons and then went on to study piano performance and pedagogy and music and theater criticism at the Ukraine National Academy of Music. Professor Assay received her PhD in musicology from Sorbonne and University of Sheffield with a dissertation entitled Hamlet in the Stalin Era, Stage and Score, which has been developed into a monograph and is contracted for publication. She was a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow and has authored several award-winning articles on Russia and Soviet music, Shakespeare, and music as well. Professor Assay is the founder of the Shakespeare and Music Study Group. She has held teaching positions at Universities of Manchester, Huddersfield, Sheffield, and Liverpool Hope, as well as Rose Bruford College. From Tehran to Ukraine to Canada, France, the UK, and then Canada again, we are honored to have Professor Assay here with us in Princeton. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much. I don't need to do anything with the microphone? No, thank you so much. Well, actually, I've smuggled one Shakespeare quote somewhere. If anybody sees it, I will have a prize for you. So I just couldn't resist it. Shakespeare has been everything I've been doing. Well, thank you. Let's see if it works. Yes. In December 2018, Bizet's Carmen made a return to operatic stage of Iran after 40 years of absence, with a stage performance at the Rudaki Hall, now known as Wahdat Hall. But this was no routine Carmen. All the singers, dancers, and creative team were women, as well as all the audience members. Since 1998, and in line with the gradual easing of restrictions under Khatami, there has been a growing number of women-only music and cultural events. Where women are allowed to perform freely, but only to an exclusively female audience. These festivals have opened the path to the return of ballet and dance, although the word dance is still prohibited and is replaced by rhythmic movements, as well as opera, where male parts are taken over by women, and female solo singing. Women-only events are just one of many workarounds that Iranians have devised since the 1979 revolution as they navigate gender politics and restrictions on women's public performance. These creative solutions have been exploiting loopholes left by the ambiguous position of Islam towards music and the shifting official guidelines regarding women and Western culture. In this respect, opera, despite its relatively short history in Iran, has been one of the most complicated arenas of ideological conflict in the country. At the same time, the history and the struggles of opera, as well as the struggles over opera, in more than one way epitomize the country's multifaceted identity and the tension between its quest for progress and the Western-style modernity on the one hand, and conservatism and Shiite Islamic tradition on the other. Or in other words, Iran as a continuation of the 2,500-year civilization, monarchy, and the Aryans with their connection to the European race, versus Iran as the cradle of Shiism and Islamic power and culture. In this paper, I shall use these narratives as a framework as I consider various stages of the establishment and development of opera in Iran, from being a European cultural import in conflict with the local traditions, to attempts at creating an Iranian opera that somehow circumnavigated such conflict. In this latter regard, the creators of the recent phenomenon of puppet opera have gone so far as claiming that they have finally established the Iranian national opera, capital initials and scare quotes. Whether the new puppet opera offers an arena where the two apparently mutually exclusive narratives could work in tandem is where my paper is headed. But first, some historical background in which opera's place as a battleground of ideological and other tensions is implicit. The introduction of Western art music to Iran came through military music during the Qajar dynasty, much later than the appearance of Western painting and visual arts. As Sahsan Fatemi argues, the initial limited influence of Western music and the strong resistance to it are significant, as they point to both a certain cultural deafness to Western musical style and the context of humiliation during the Russo-Persian Wars of 1804 to 1813 and 1824 to 1828 that cost Iran much of its territory. Quote, "Lost to foreigners and non-Muslims and accepting their superiority would have been considered an inadmissible and inexplicable failure within Iran's cultural circles." End quote. Notwithstanding the cultural resistance, modernization, or in effect westernization of the military, brought with it Western-style music, gaining momentum during Nasser ad-Din Shah's reign, and especially thanks to the Frenchman Jean-Baptiste Alfred Lemaire. The first steps towards opera's introduction to Iran was part of Nasser ad-Din Shah's fascination with the West. Even if it would be an exaggeration to claim he actually brought opera to Iran. He had attended operas and ballets during his much publicized tours to the West, and had written at length in his diaries about the dazzling beauty and grandeur of opera houses in Vienna, Belgium, St. Petersburg, and London's Royal Albert Hall. Curiously, there is almost no description there of music, and whatever is referred to about singers and ballet dancers mainly concerns their appearances and clothes. Nasser ad-Din Shah's response came in the form of one of the most written about and discussed buildings of Tehran, Takiye Dolat. I'm standing in front of it, I just realized. Then, Takiye Dolat was the most important public playhouse. To this day, there are many contradictory theories about the architecture being modeled after the Royal Albert Hall, even though the building of Takiye started in 1868, so before the Shah's visit to London. And whether or not it was meant for staging Western art style, opera and ballet is another point of discussion. Nevertheless, it is safe to say that the project was conceived within the context of Westernization and competition with the West. But instead of opera, the building became a cradle for Ta'ziyeh, the homegrown pageant play with roots in pre-Islamic Iran, turning Ta'ziyeh from a village and community event into an art form, resulting in the golden age for the genre. So, Other efforts towards promotion of Western art music and opera during this period seemed not to have left significant aesthetic impact, even on the king himself. As one foreign visitor wrote, the king, Nasser ad-Din Shah, clearly preferred Persian and even Turkish or Arabic to European music. Nevertheless, he would greatly encourage Western music and especially operas. Before the curtain truly rose on Western-style opera in Iran, from the constitutional period of the early 20th century, a different type of musical performance contributed to the familiarization and eventually appropriation of the word opera and especially operette. At this time, the use of the word opera, and indeed all words related to Western music, was more a way of alluding to progress than a direct invocation of a Western equivalent. I'm confusing this is not a pianist presentation. I'm confused. My hands are not in coordination. I should be a bit better as a pianist. Okay, let's try like this. Not confuse myself. Voila. Okay. This particular branch of musical theater was originally popularized thanks to composers from Caucasian regions, and especially Uzair Hajibeyov, whose 1908 Layli and Majnun is often considered to be the first opera from the Muslim East and reportedly the first to be performed in Iran. As with Hajibeyov's other operette, Arshin Malalan, it combines folkloric music with maqams and relied heavily on improvisation and individual singing techniques. In Iran, it was the revolutionary poet Mirzadeh Eshghi who penned the first work to be designated opera. Following a trip to Istanbul, Eshghi wrote Resurrection of Iran's Monarchs as a lament on the miserable state of the country compared to his idealization of its glorious Zoroastrian past. Although many consider Eshghi's work as the first ever Iranian opera, in reality it is no more than a play with a few musical numbers. There is no score. Instead, the text includes indications as to which song or melody from a familiar collection was to be performed. The so-called opera was performed in 1920 in Isfahan and shortly after in Tehran, becoming a favorite with the audiences, and even performed in Bombay or Mumbai in English translation. Several other operas and operettas were written and performed during this time and following Eshghi's. Their programs often included such words as orchestra, even if it was only a small ensemble, even such terms as epopée, that is lyric opera, lyric drama. These usually carried the name of the librettist as the main creator rather than the composer, and often had subject matter taken from the Persian literature or folklore. Some of these features point forward to puppet operas of recent years, as we shall see. Following the assumption of power and establishment of the Pahlavi dynasty in 1925, Reza Shah embarked on building a Western-style opera house for the capital. The project was largely a competition with Turkey's progress in artistic and cultural spheres. But all too soon, it appeared doomed and was abandoned. Reportedly, once the walls were all built and raised, the builders realized that the designed ceiling would not fit. So the architect left the country, and not surprisingly, the correspondence that has remained from about this project and its cost to the country is both amusing and sad. It was in particular during the reign of Mohammad Reza Shah, son of Reza Shah and the last Shah of Iran, from 1941, that cultural westernization gained momentum. Thanks to foreign teachers, a new generation of Western-style musicians was trained, many of whom would later continue their education in the West. The Austrian singer Lili Bara, who moved to Iran after the war, became a particularly sought-after teacher at the Conservatoire from 1946. A year later, she mounted an opera by Gluck, the deceived judge, in what is considered the first full opera performance in Tehran. In 1960, the Opera Committee of Tehran was established, consisting of the crème de la crème of classical music, such as Evelyn Bakhcheban, mezzo-soprano, Emmanuel Malik Aslanian, composer and pianist, Hishmat Sanjari, conductor, and Fakhere Sabah, mezzo-soprano. They oversaw the activities of opera group, organized vocal festivals, recruited Italian singers and teachers, and eventually staged operas. In 1961, Donizetti's Don Pasquale was the first full opera to be staged by the group, featuring both Iranian and Italian singers and performers. This was followed by several other opera projects, culminating in the first opera featuring mainly Iranian singers in the shape of Mozart's Così fan tutte in 1967. In the same year, and to coincide with the Shah's coronation, Rudaki Hall, the country's first modern opera house, was inaugurated. To mark the inauguration, Ahmad Pejman was commissioned to compose the first Iranian opera, Jashn Dehqan, the rustic festival, followed the next year by Dilavar Sahand. I was unable to find any recording of the former. Reportedly, everybody was so busy filming the king and the queen that they forgot to film or record anything in the Rudaki Hall. But I did find one for the latter. Now, I will keep the playing of this probably for the question and answer. But if we judge by the music, and you will hear later if you have time, despite its theme relating to the 9th century Persian revolutionary, Babak Khorramdel, the music is largely a combination of 1930s Hollywoodian film score and echoes of Borodin's Orientalist palovts and dances. The incipient so-called golden age of Western opera in Iran was also marked by numerous foreign productions and guest visitors. Under the patronage of the royal family, Iran's opera group and national ballet enjoyed the elite status both socially and financially. But this all came at the expense of increasing Western influence. Reportedly, 80% of the opera troupe consisted of foreign performers. With the 1979 revolution, opera and ballet activities, as with many other cultural sectors, came to a halt. Much has been written about Khomeini's attitude towards music, with almost all statements resting firmly on the black and white image of the Ayatollahs banning music. Women were the first victims of the revolution, shortly followed by music. That's a phrase I myself have often used in one way or another, especially when appearing on radio programs, when I felt the need for a dramatic point-making, or indeed in grant applications. As someone who was born just before the revolution and experienced at first hand the draconian controls, I feel on some personal level I may have the right to stand by this claim. But in reality, the situation was much more complex, and it was paradoxically the shape-shifting nature of those restrictions that led to both extreme caution and creative solutions. In his 1979 speech to state radio and TV, Khomeini indeed branded music as opium for the youth and called for the abandoning of all Western music. Nevertheless, already by October that same year, in his rather surreal interview with the Italian journalist Oriana Fallaci, there is a blink it or you miss it whiff of flexibility. In response to Khomeini's claim that your music is like drug for the soul, Fallaci asked, even Bach, Verdi, and Beethoven? Khomeini replied, I do not know those names. If their music does not, I bet he knew, if their music does not dull the mind, they will not be prohibited. Some of your music is permitted. Certainly revolutionary songs continued to provide a soundtrack to the new society, sometimes featuring former singers of the opera, as in Esfandiar Qarebaghi's rendition of the popular anti-American song Amrika, Amrika Nang B'nei Rang To, composed following the hostage crisis of 1979-81. With the Iran-Iraq War, military music and later selection of music of Persian traditional nature regularly accompanied images from the front. A selection of solemn instrumental Western classical pieces, such as Adagio attributed to Albinoni, and even Samuel Barber's Adagio would also pop up on TV, especially on days of mourning. Even symphonic classical music soon made a return to Rudaki Hall, commonly programmed alongside revolutionary and or Persian traditional repertoire. Cassette recordings of classical music, including opera, circulated at first underground, then semi-officially. But public performances of opera and ballet remained off limits, largely due to the persisting taboo on the female solo voice, a problem that to this day blights Iran's musical scene. As Ervand Abrahamian argues in his seminal book on Khomeini, like populists of the world over, modified his rhetoric depending on political circumstances. Using 1982 as a dividing point, Abrahamian illustrates the toning down of rhetoric vis-à-vis a fundamentalist approach to Islam and in particular private property. In his epilogue, He shows how, following Khomeini's death in 1989, the purge of the hardliners gathered momentum as Rafsanjani became president. Abrahamian's arguments are mainly conducted through the prism of economy, bazaar, and private property, but are largely applicable to music as well. The reforms during Rafsanjani's and even more importantly, Khatami's presidencies in the 1990s and early 2000s opened the door to greater contact with the West, including with Western musicians and teachers of classical music. Representatives of London Trinity College of Music would audition and examine aspiring Iranian musicians. And the Austrian Cultural Center offered regular masterclasses and a range of musical activities. Along with these initiatives came tentative attempts at the revival of opera in Iran, exploring again loopholes left by the ambiguous rulings on the female voice. Now, while the Quran itself contains no reference to the topic of female voice, or indeed to music at all, some Islamic scholars and leaders have considered idle talk, which Quran does prohibit, to include music, and hence have designated music haram, unacceptable, sinful. Others have referred to hadith, teaching passed on by oral tradition, as the basis for what is allowed and what is not. When it comes to the female singing voice, a persistent doctrine of Sharia law prescribes it as arousing and hence haram, unless the woman is singing for her mahram, husband or close blood relation. Again, that's defined by the Sharia. The ambiguity, oh sorry, this is a word that this morning I've gone over it over and over with my husband. Ambiguity of what should or should not be considered arousing has allowed gaps to appear, which Iranian artists have been exploiting. Their strategies have included using the voice as an instrument, that is singing without words like a vocalise, female-only performance, and even more creatively, co-singing, hamkhani, whereby the woman's voice is heard alongside a man's or that of a group of women. In practice, the co-singer often lip-syncs or sings as quietly as possible in order to allow for the female solo voice to take the lead. This last solution has helped with the ongoing, if tentative, return of opera to Iran, whereby female solo parts have been ostensibly sung by more than one woman. This was the case of what was described as the first opera performance in post-revolutionary Iran, Puccini's Gianni Schicchi in 2011, and also in the 2013 revival of Mozart's The Magic Flute, where the Queen of the Night was accompanied by 5 other women on each side, who lip-synced to the music, pretending that the aria was an act of collective singing. Nevertheless, female voice obstacle seems to have offered carte blanche to the Ministry of Culture and Enlightenment to refuse performances on whatever ground it chooses. As for operas composed by Iranians, it took over 30 years and several aborted attempts for Hossein Dehlavi's children's opera called Mana and Mani, composed on the eve of the revolution, to be partially performed. Some 45 minutes of the opera that featured the voice of the female protagonist were rewritten or effectively censored. Reports from the rehearsal in 2012 suggest that Dehlavi was unable to recognize his own opera. He kept asking, "Did I write this?" Which, on one hand, could have been attributed partially to his dementia, but perhaps also to the extensive rewrites. Rather more radically, and as early as 2005, the theater director and puppeteer Behruz Gharibpour had come up with a unique solution to bypass the restrictions not only on women's voices, but also concerning the obligatory hijab. When Gharibpour was approached to stage Loris Cheknavarian's opera Rustam and Sohrab, he knew that he was facing the task of mounting the first staging of an Iranian opera after revolution. Rustam and Sohrab, based on Ferdowsi's epic book of Shahnameh, was also one of only a handful of operas composed by Iranians. Thanks to his already legendary status as a conductor, Cheknavarian had managed to mount a concert performance of this opera as early as 2002 with an ensemble of mainly non-Iranians or non-Iran-based soloists. Taking advantage of the moderate and reformist regime of the time and arguing that existing restrictions would make it impossible for him to do the music justice on the stage, Gharipour introduced what would become a unique hallmark of the new Iranian opera, which is puppet opera. By using puppets instead of live singers, Gharipour was solving several problems at once. The problem of solo singing of a woman was circumnavigated by hiding the source of the voice, and double-proofed by using a recording rather than a live performance. Furthermore, as he explained to me, Ferdowsi's poetry is filled with metaphors referring to the heroine Tahmine's beautiful hair, and the hijab rule would have meant that a human singer would have had to cover that hair, whereas the authorities seem to have had no problem with a hijabless puppet. Reportedly, 100 marionettes and 15 puppeteers were involved in the staging. I'm tempted to play a few seconds so that you can see what it looked like. If I remember how to do this, yeah. This is Tahmine. Again, need to remember how. Okay. Following the success of puppet staging, Gharipour moved on to produce Verdi's Macbeth in 2007, in order to prove, as he said to me, that the medium of puppets was potentially suitable for all operas. The international success of Macbeth as far abroad as Italy led Gharipour to set himself the ambitious goal of reviving and updating Iran's ancient traditional passion plays, the ta'ziyeh, the very same genre that had dominated the Takiye-Dolat in the late 19th century. For those unfamiliar with the genre ta'ziyeh, it means literally meaning expression of grief. It is a ritual, dramatic art that recounts religious events, historical and mythical stories, and folk tales. While its roots go back to pre-Islamic Persian traditions, especially of the so-called Siyavashan, its global popularity is intertwined with the Shiite Islamic traditions, in particular the reenacting of Ashura, the 7th century massacre of Hussein, a grandson of Prophet Muhammad, and his followers in the desert of Karbala in today's Iraq. With music, song, recitative-like speeches, and movement, ta'ziyeh has often been described as Iran's answer to opera. This is certainly one of Gharipour's favorite arguments when describing his 2008 Ashura as the first national opera of Iran. For this enterprise, he chose to work with a young Iranian composer and graduate of Kiev Conservatoire, Behzad Abdi, and the National Symphony Orchestra of Ukraine, conducted by Volodymyr Sirenko. I can't resist playing a 1-minute excerpt.
یزیدت میدهد اسب و زر و مازندران و ری کجا دل فروشد باغ جنت را به ملک ری دیگر سخن زین گونه ای هر ننگ و آمد کو تو خود باد خزانی دائما فصل بهارت کو یا صاحب ذوالفقار وقت مدد است یا واله اشک و چار وقت مدد است.
Gharipour was hoping to bring together Persian, Western and Islamic traditions, which is to say Persian traditional singing, ta'ziyeh and khayme shab-bazi, Western opera, Western orchestra and compositional technique, and the theme of Ashura. In other words, his aim was to make the historical double narratives work in tandem rather than against one another. In his score, Abdi employed Persian modes, or radif, alongside Western instruments, juxtaposing radif singing with symphonic accompaniments and interludes. Many traditions of ta'ziyeh were taken on board. For instance, villains were given recitative-like speeches, as you could hear, while intricate melodic singing lines were allocated to heroes. Visually, too, villains were dressed in shades of red, while Imam Hussein's and people were in green or white, children in black with green ribbons. Employing leading Persian traditional singers and dramatic lighting effects and stagecraft, Ashura became a phenomenal success that not only overturned preconceptions regarding the staging of opera in Iran, but also tackled the taboo of giving a physical appearance to a Shiite holy figure by depicting Imam Hussein as a marionette, although the puppet's face was blank, a white page. Despite the initial risk of the project being cancelled, Ashura has gone on to be performed regularly, including a very recent updated version at the Rudaki Hall, where puppeteers are physically present on the stage. The apparent change of official stance, at least to the point of benign indifference, again points to the unpredictability of the apparently monolithic regime. Even so, newspaper reports such as Qajar felt the necessity to add a trigger warning about the inclusion of a solo female singing voice. Ashura was also warmly received when performed in a marionette festival in France, but ironically, the reviewers' praise for what Gharipour has considered an innovative modernization was mainly couched in terms of the show as a solid representative of old-fashioned marionette theater. Gharipour followed the success of Ashura with a series of so-called operas based on works of classical Persian poets. These include, but are not limited to these numbers because there were several others, Maulana, retelling of Rumi's life and journey to enlightenment, Hafiz, a retelling of Hafiz's spiritual encounters, and more recently, Eshq, literally love, based on a poem from the Conference of Birds by Attar Nishaburi. In all these, the music is a combination of Persian traditional music using radifs and Western-style composition. Some elements of popular music are also introduced, Persian popular music. While fundamental tradition of ta'ziyeh is still employed in the distribution of vocal parts, the Iranianness is further emphasized through the subject matter being rooted in Persian literature, with a nod to Iran's ancient tradition of khayme shab-bazi, or marionette theater. In doing so, puppet opera in more than one way offers an arena for interplay between the various narratives that shape Iran's national identity. In parentheses, and outside frame of my argument, Gharipour's latest project on which he's working is a cynical retelling of the Jack and the Beanstalk tale. He uses Iranian new popular music. I would like at this point to play just two short excerpts from two of the other puppet operas. This one has also a subtitle.
که از نهیبش میرمد جنی و دی.
وای همچو اصحاب عذاب آوازشان بد گرفته از فغان و سازشان، ریشمو برکنده رو بدویدگان، خاک بر سر کرده خون پر دیدگان.
And the next one is from Hafiz. If I could just find the exact place. Oh, come on, work now. It's been so nice. That's the very ending, as you can hear. Oops. Just to clarify that the words, the libretto for all these operas are entirely based, uses entirely the Persian poetry. Not all of them from Hafiz, for Hafiz, also from other places, but he kind of puts them together. He says he creates a kind of amalgam of all of them, and it gives it a narrative. Narrative is a bit, sometimes it's stretched, but it's just encountered. It's not so, it's more like an oratorio drama rather than the excess drama of operas, the Western style opera. But it works. As with most nationalist claims, rhetoric around Iran's national opera is at the same time reactive and suprematist. Among such dual-purpose statements are such claims voiced by Gharibpour in various places, including to me personally, as, quote, Iran already had opera in the form of ta'ziyeh long before Westerners came up with the idea of it, which, while acknowledging the superiority of opera, places Iran as an initiator rather than a follower. Similarly, such a statement as, if it wasn't for my efforts with the puppet opera, opera would have disappeared from Iran, point to the agency and the importance of opera as a genre that apparently needs to be saved, as well as to Gharibpour's sense of personal mission. There's another competing opinion among critics and some musicians, especially those educated and active during the Pahlavi time. This is the notion that words such as opera, operette, performance, using the English word, in recent years are used mainly as instruments of marketing, appealing to a particular social class. Among proponents of this opinion are Ali Rahbari, or he calls himself Alexander Rahbari, former conductor of the Tehran Symphony Orchestra, and Cheknavarian himself. Some commentators have also openly criticized the low standard of staging and music making in Iran, with Cheknavarian recently saying he no longer feels comfortable working with the orchestra due to their unpreparedness. It will take 30 years for an opera singer to be ready, says he. So if we start now, in 30 years, we may have world-class, world-standard singers. Another point of contention has concerned the status of the first opera after revolution, which seems to have many contenders. Historically, Gharibpour's staging of Rustam and Sohrab precedes Gianni Schicchi, and certainly the 2019 staging of Cheknavarian's other opera, Pardis and Parisa, which has recently claimed to be the first Iranian opera to be staged after the revolution. Yet creative teams of the other contenders have argued that Gharibpour's use of puppets and pre-recorded performance disqualifies it as an opera altogether. The same argument has been addressed to him in response to the idea of puppet opera as Iran's national opera. When I put these comments to him, Gharibpour's withering response was, "You should ask the question that if a place doesn't have any opera school, if there is no possibility of repeating a work, if the government doesn't support, and if there is no proper orchestra, should one just sit back and do nothing and pay attention to the blabbings of the fossils? These people are ignorant and have got stuck between the pages of history," I was told. Plenty to unwrap there, both on the status of opera and on modernization through opera. This time, not opera as a heritage of the West, but opera as appropriated by Iran. Elsewhere, especially in the royalist diaspora, there are definitely those who are stuck among the pages of history. Here, there is a strong tendency to mourn the loss of opera in Iran, largely through eulogies that hail pre-revolutionary operatic activities. Balancing these views are attempts by aspiring young Iranian composers outside Iran, who strive to imbue their works, many of them called opera, with themes referring to their roots or responding to current issues in Iran. The burden of representation, that is the notion that diasporic artists are expected to include their ethnicity in their works in order to get noticed, might play a part. But whatever the motivations, there are ever-increasing communication routes between these diasporic musicians and their counterparts in Iran, such as IFCA, Iranian Female Composers Association. So, it won't be surprising if a new generation of opera composers is in preparation. Opera, again, here being understood as an umbrella term for something that ranges from musical theater to oratorio. In an interview with a producer and librettist of one such opera, who again considered the opera to be her work rather than that of the composer, I asked her the reason for choosing the title opera. Her main answer was, opera has an undeniable cachet and prestige. In Iran, too, opera has become a catch-all name for a large variety of musical performances. I hasten to add that unlike the diasporic projects, those in Iran are almost exclusively led by men, and female roles are still subject to various kinds of scrutiny. Nevertheless, there has been a growing number of works featuring ensembles of Persian traditional music and music of almost exclusive Radif and improvisatory tradition, which their creators call opera, and many, yet again, claim to have produced the first Iranian opera. So far, they have stayed clear of the word national. And as we've seen, their use of the term opera has not gone without criticism, especially from past singers and musicians who were involved with the Western opera in Iran. After all, it was just about 100 years ago that Ali Naqi Waziri, who was one of the first masters of Persian traditional music to know and promote theories of Western classical music, offered the definition. Opera is where 5 different branches of arts come together under the direction of the baton of the conductor, revealing their beauties and wonders from beautiful buildings and architecture to bodies and body movement, to painting that represent nature, to literature and most excellent words, and finally, the life and soul that music breathes into them. It's tempting to assess the credentials of the new operas against its definition. The chances are that they won't fit the bill, or at most to a limited extent. Yet, compared to the pre-revolutionary practice of performing the Western operatic canon, as I have shown, post-revolutionary Iran has seen interesting attempts, such as puppet opera, which are arguably more indigenous than Western, more democratic than elitist, and more accessible than exclusive, and even potentially better suited to placing Iran as a player in the global musical scene. Of course, only time will tell whether or not such speculations is merely empty words. Whether puppet opera can build on its success or even encourage and allow other means of creative adaptation and appropriation remains to be seen. What is certain is that even more than nationalist agendas, gender politics and women's agency will have a say. For the moment, solutions such as puppet opera have been offering an outlet for the talent of Iran's many women singers. Admittedly, when I first showed my mother an excerpt from Rostam and Sohrab, which with Tahmineh as a puppet, she started weeping. This is what our women have been reduced to, mere puppets. Yet, having spoken to some of the singers involved in the puppet operas, they all have told me of their pride for being a part of the projects and of the scarcity of similar opportunities. Behind each scene with a female puppet solo singing, there is a long story of negotiations, creative inventions, and sometimes, alas, cancellation and defeat. To avoid the latter, women singers have to hide rather than promote their talents, keeping a low profile to deflect the attention of the authorities. This is the nightmare we live in 24/7, one singer told me, echoing Eshghpour's earlier words to me. So I'm caught here between wanting to give my paper a grand, perfect cadence that celebrates the new directions that opera has taken in Iran, or a solemn morendo, dying away, about the wealth of creative energy wasted on fighting unnecessary censorship. Well, some of the finest operas and symphonies of all time end on a note of quiet ambivalence. So perhaps you'll forgive me for following their example. After all, it is thanks to ambivalence from above that opera has survived and been reconfigured at all in Iran. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.